following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools. Funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
This program was made possible through generous support from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. The Real Martha Washington is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens.
Hello and welcome to The Real Martha Washington. I'm Kate Sullivan and I'll be your host. I'm very excited today because in just a few minutes, Martha Washington will be here to answer questions from students in our audience, as well as those watching in our classroom here and those across the country. Now, before we meet Mrs. Washington, let's watch a short video about her.
Martha Washington was born Martha Dandridge on June 2, 1731 in New Kent County, Virginia. Her education was fairly typical for a girl of her class, stressing housekeeping, religion, music, and dancing, skills necessary for the wife of a Virginia gentleman and planter. At age 18, the 5-foot-tall, brown-haired young woman married Daniel Parke Custis, who 20 years her senior was one of the richest and most eligible bachelors in Virginia. After only 7 years of marriage, Daniel died suddenly, making Martha the wealthiest widow in Virginia.
After Daniel Parke Custis died, this young widow with 2 little children, and she had lost a couple of children, so she was nervous about these children, immediately took over the business.
Since he did die prematurely, he had not made a will, and Martha Washington had to step in then and take over his responsibilities very quickly.
Some of the few letters we have of hers in this period are letters to England, essentially saying, I'm in charge now, correspond with me.
She just took over right where he had left off, and there doesn't seem to be any reluctance on her part to assume this role.
Plantation was a big business, and she was running them.
After her mourning period ended, several men began courting the young widow. She met George Washington while he was on leave from the French and Indian War. They were married at her Southern Virginia home on January 6, 1759. A few months later, Martha arrived at Mount Vernon with her 2 children, Jackie and Patsy. The Washingtons lived a life typical of Virginia planters of the time. He watched over his lands and business ventures and was active in Virginia politics and society, while she supervised the education of her children and made sure that the domestic operations of the plantation ran smoothly.
Joining me now is Mrs. Martha Washington. Good afternoon, Mrs. Washington.
Good day, mistress.
How is life at Mount Vernon?
Oh, indeed, we thrive. We are newly arrived to the plantation, and in truth, I never thought I would be so very far from my own home in New Kent County. But I have learned through the greater part of experience that our happiness or our misery depends not upon our circumstances, but upon our dispositions. We will carry the seeds of the one or the other about with us in our minds wherever we go. And I am ever desirous to be possessed of a cheerful and pleasant mind in whatever situation I may be indeed. Since we have been at Mount Vernon, you can imagine to have a war hero as a stepfather for my children is quite a fine thing indeed. And in truth, I think if I did not remind my Jackie and my Patsy of their dearly departed father, Mr. Custis, they would never know the difference.
Mm-hmm. We have many email questions from students around the country. We'll begin our discussion right now with an email question from Mrs. Hammond's 7th grade class at Shawnee Middle School in Shawnee, Oklahoma. As a young girl, what sort of things did you do when you were not in school, Mrs. Washington?
Oh, indeed. I suppose much of my education occurred throughout the day, but I have always delighted in gardening, horseback riding when I were of an age to do so, reading out, and I am the oldest of 8. And so I have a number of sisters and brothers, and we always had our minds upon one thing or the other. And my cousins lived across the river, so there were quite a number of us.
Many playmates.
Indeed,
Yes.
absolutely.
Well, Mrs. Morales' third grade class at the Buckley School in New York would like to know, where did you meet George Washington?
Oh, I suppose I had known Mr. Washington for quite a number of years by the very nature of his reputation, that of a dashing young war hero. But it is my neighbour, Colonel Chamberlain, who formally reintroduced us at his home in the mid of March of '58. And, well, I will give over that after that meeting, Mr. Washington paid 2 calls upon me at my own plantation, and then in June, some months later, as I were writing to my factor in London, I asked him to include sundry items for a bride.
A momentous meeting, wasn't it?
Indeed,
Yes.
it was.
Well, we have a question now from our audience here in the studio. Who would like to ask a first question of Mrs. Washington? Yes, this young man in the back, if you'll wait just a moment for the microphone. What's your name and what's your question?
My name is Jason. How did you feel when Daniel Custis died?
Well, indeed, it is a very excellent query that you make. My husband passed so very suddenly. He had not always had the finest of health, but that spring, that summer, I had seen him in the best health I had seen in all years of our marriage. But within 3 days, he were taken from me. I suppose it is a great thing to lose not only a husband, but 2 children, very close to one another. There were a great burden of the properties put upon me. It is not that ladies cannot manage plantations, it is just that it is a gentleman's sphere, and to place both spheres upon one person's shoulders, both a man's sphere and a woman's sphere, is not anything I would wish upon anyone. But indeed, I had a great number of friends and family who did assist me.
We have another question. Mrs. Feste's 5th grade class from Witt Intermediate School in West Hartford, Connecticut asks, did your children go to school when they moved to Mount Vernon?
Oh, well, they were educated, mind you. My son, we have hired a tutor for him, though he is not as diligent as I would care for him. He does delight in that of the sport and leisure. I have a notion that when my daughter sets a finer hand upon the slate than my son, he will become more diligent very quickly. They do have that of music masters, that of those tutors which educate children in things that render them more loving and useful to their company. And I do look to their letters, their numbers, their catechism, and certainly my daughter's housewifery duties, instructing her in the same.
How about another question from the students in our audience? How about this young lady right down front? What's your name and what's your question?
My name is Amy, and my question is, how old were you when your first child was born?
Oh, I was just that of nigh 20 years of age. My first child was a son, and named for his father, Daniel Park Custis.
Mrs. Silva's 4th grade class at Indian Hills Elementary School in Manomet, Massachusetts wants to know, what kinds of games do your children like playing?
Oh, indeed, there are quite a number of them. They delight in blind man's bluff, thread the needle, cricket, kite flying. There's all matter of games of chase and the like, hoop rolling, riddling out, singing out. There are a good number of entertainments.
That's right. Another question from our audience. We have a lot of good questions in our audience today. What about this young lady right down here? If you'll just wait for the microphone to come and tell us your name and your question.
My name is Sophia, and I was wondering, how would you feel if one of your kids suddenly had a drop in education?
Had a
job in education. How would you feel if one of your children were a teacher, for example?
Well, indeed, it is not quite the calling for a lady. And certainly my son is also born to a better... well, I should put it this way. The Custis lands are very vast indeed. There is nigh 20,000 acres, several plantations spread out within 7 different counties, and my children will inherit each a third. Mr. Washington looks over it to them, and so My son, I hope, will look to his plantations and serve his king and country in the burgesses. And my daughter, I hope she will marry well and be the mistress of her household. That would please me most.
Another question from our audience today. How about this young man in the second row? The microphone's on its way. What is your name and what is your question?
My name's Dan, and I was wondering, was your parents strict?
Were my parents strict? I suppose no stricter than any others. Indeed, we were allowed freedoms to run about that to the plantation. But mind, when I turned 10, that is nigh the age that a young lady must turn to the duties of her housewifery duties and learning out to be like her mama, and a young boy should look to the duties much as his papa. So before I was 10, I would say I had greater freedoms, and afterwards I had more responsibilities, as is befitting.
All right. Another email question. Mrs. Speed's 5th grade class at Juniper Elementary School has a question for you, and the question would be, do you own slaves, and what are their jobs?
Oh, well, naturally, I have a good number of people. I dare say the Custis property is nigh 300 people, but again, only 200 are there at our primary residence of White House in New Kent. Naturally, I could not bring all of those people with me to Mount Vernon. It is a much smaller home. And so I have brought 15 of my household and their families, nigh 50 people in total. And that includes waiters, tradesmen such as carpenters and tanners, as well as my immediate household staff, my own maid, my children's servants, and a girl who sews for them, Rose, my cook Dole, Mima, Jenny, that of the scullery maiden, the laundress. There is a good number that I have brought with me. One cannot manage a plantation without the assistance of one's people.
You managed it yourself. That's quite remarkable, Mrs. Washington. Well, we have another short video about Martha Washington during the American Revolution and her husband's presidency.
Martha Washington made a tremendous contribution to the Continental Army. In fact, I can make the case that she kept the Continental Army together at various times when soldiers were threatening desertion by regiment. She would come into camp with her carriage filled with cloth and foodstuffs that had been made at Mount Vernon over the summer, and then she would organize the officers' wives, and they would cook for the soldiers, they would sew for the soldiers, they would pray with the soldiers, they would nurse the soldiers, and put on great entertainments for them to keep morale up and keep the soldiers in the army.
Washington regarded her as crucial, and when he was submitting his expenses to Congress, he included as a request that Congress would reimburse him for the expenses of her travel.
After the war, the Washingtons were eagerly anticipating spending their time in peaceful retirement with family and friends. However, the now famous couple had a constant stream of visitors, and in 1789, George was again called to serve his country as its first president. As the president's wife, Martha became our first First Lady.
Creating the role of First Lady was a political act. The European nations were not really taking us seriously, and so she had to create a role where it was grand enough for the Europeans to not laugh at us, but simple enough for Republican government.
She had to walk this fine line between, being dignified, having people look up to her, but at the same time not acting regal or having any supposition that she was assuming too much authority to herself. Martha Washington was a reluctant First Lady. She really did not desire the role, but as with her widowhood, she assumed it with gusto. I mean, she did it with vigor, and she executed her duties in a most appropriate manner.
She understood hospitality. She had a tremendous Southern charm, but she also understood the role of formality and dignity. And she really did set the precedent for everyone who came after her.
Mrs. Washington, can you tell us a little bit more about your life during this period?
Well, I'm so glad to be here and talk with everyone about all that I have known and been privileged to see, I suppose I would want all the children to know of the sacrifice that was made during the war, our war for independency. The young soldiers that I took care of needed so much, and I was very glad to be able to be there at every winter camp. There were hard journeys to get there, but when I saw the soldiers, when I saw what they were enduring, my heart went out to them, and I am happy to say, theirs to me. They used to call me Lady Washington, the soldier's friend. I'm proud of that, my dear.
I'm sure you are. We have another email question, and this one comes from Mrs. Rogers' 5th grade class from Mount Diablo Unified School District in Concord, California. The class would like to know, did you have a specific job when you visited the Army during the winter encampments?
My chief duty during the winter was to see to the soldiers who were so ill. Many of them had camp fever, and also the smallpox, was happening then. So I had to go and nurse them. Every single day I went out. I had a red cape, and the soldiers always said they want to see me come with my red cape. They could see me at a distance. I carried my basket with medicine and also the book of prayer, just to be of comfort to them. I'm glad I got to go every day to see to their needs. That was crucial.
You were really risking your own life.
Oh,
you could have caught one of those diseases.
Well, I really had to summon all my bravery. In '76, I had myself inoculated against the smallpox. And if you ever have an inoculation, you wonder how it's going to go. But I did it because the general wanted me to be safe nursing the soldiers. I was a little afraid, but I went ahead with it.
We have another email question. The book club at W.R. Thomas Middle School in Miami, Florida asks, how did you feel when Jackie enlisted in the Continental Army?
My dear son, John Park, was now the last of my children. My sweet daughter was taken from us, passing when she was only 17 years old, and so of course he was very dear to me. He already had 4 little children born when he decided to go and be with the general. I could not deny him that opportunity to be at the general's side, and I had nursed so many other women's sons. I was a little afraid, but duty is important, doing your duty, and I was proud too that he was doing his.
We have many questions in our studio audience today. How about let's take another one. How about this young man? What is your name and what's your question for Mrs. Washington?
My name is Richie, and how many pets did your husband have?
Oh, Richie, that's a good question. We've had lots of animals about the place at Mount Vernon. The general loves his horses best, and he used to keep quite a kennel of hunting dogs. Do you all know hunting dogs? Oh, he called them the most ridiculous names, Sweet Lips and True Love and Duchess, and his most famous, Vulcan, who once jumped up on my table and grabbed a whole ham and ran off with it. I was upset, but the general just laughed and called it charming.
A good sense of humor he had, yes. Well, Mrs. Downer's 5th grade class from Fremont Elementary in La Cañada, California asks, General Washington liked farming and gardening. Do you like gardens too?
I love gardens, and I'm glad that at Mount Vernon we have 2 gardens. We have our lower garden that provides food for our body. I'm very fond of my vegetables. I hope you eat all your vegetables. Good. And then we have our upper garden, which has our flowers and the general's new greenhouse, and I like that very much. You need food to give sustenance to your body, and food for your soul or your spirit that the flowers give. I love roses especially.
Mrs. Malone's 4th grade class in Springfield, Massachusetts wants to know, do your grandchildren live with you and what kind of games do they like?
Well, my grandchildren are pretty well grown up now, but we raised our 2 youngest when they were very small, and we began to bring them up. They were 8 and 10 years of age. Washi, my grandson and Nellie when their grandpapa became president. So they had the delight of being country children. They used to ride on that dog Vulcan, by the way he was so large, as if he were a pony. And they loved all the country games here. But then when grandpapa was president, they got to go to Grand Philadelphia, attend plays upon the stage. Our butler even made a special dish for their parties. It's called iced cream. I hope you get to taste it sometime.
Me too. Mrs. Easter's third grade class in Tupelo, Mississippi asks, did you like being the First Lady, and what responsibilities did you have in that role?
Well, I have to be honest, because the general believes that honesty is the best policy. I didn't like having to be away from home, so I even thought that I was very much like a prisoner when I had to go away from Mount Vernon and be the country's president's lady. But I was brought up that you make the best of every situation. And my mother always said, keep yourself busy as a bee, cheerful as a cricket, steady as a clock. So I decided to make the best, to look out for the general's health now that he was the new president, make certain he was all right, and entertain everyone, keep them busy so he had a little more time for himself. And, of course, raising the grandchildren. They gave me great joy.
Great words of wisdom from you today. Mrs. Lopez's class from Calusa Elementary School in Miami, Florida wants to know, where was the president's house when you lived there?
Well, we had several houses. We were first in the city of New York, which of course is not as large as Philadelphia City, and we had a house on Cherry Street there. And then when we moved to Philadelphia, when the seat of government was removed there, we had a house that was lent to us by Robert and Mary Morris on 190 the High Street. We had to live in borrowed homes the whole 8 years, so I'm very glad now that they're building this new federal city in the District of Columbia, they're going to get a permanent house built for the president and his family. I think they need that. Borrowed houses aren't so good.
All right. Well, Mrs. Washington, we have time for one final question from our studio audience. We have a lot of hands raised, but we can only pick at least just one.
How will you do it?
Yes. How about this young lady right over here? We'll wait for the microphone to come.
My name's Emily, and
that happens to me all the time, Emily. You know, I tend to forget a little bit.
What was it like when George Washington turned down being the king?
Oh, well, you know, I don't think I'd make a very good Queen of America, do you? Do you know, it is really an unusual thing. We don't think of having kings in our country, but after the war, everybody wanted to make him the King of America. I had grown up having a King of England, and so I knew we wanted a different country. So I was glad that he turned it down. But you know, it was the first time in history anybody ever did that, and he did it. I'm very proud of that.
That's remarkable. I know you said that you were rather shy and you were a little reluctant to be First Lady, so it must have been a little frightening to think that you would be Queen.
I don't think it would have suited me very well. I'm an unassuming sort of person.
All right. Well, now it's time to return to modern times and meet the two women who portrayed Martha Washington for us today. Our second Martha Washington was presented by historic interpreter Mary Wiseman. And now, joining us for this discussion, our first Martha Washington, historic interpreter Susan Zeckow. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for the wonderful presentation today. I'd like to know how each of you got started portraying Martha Washington. Susan, it's you.
I worked at Colonial Williamsburg for a number of years, and in 1995, Mary had started the Women's Forum for History, which takes place in March, and the subject was Martha Washington, and they were focusing on her youth. And that was the time of her life where she was best associated with Williamsburg. And so we worked with Mount Vernon, we worked with Colonial Williamsburg, we had special projects that were developed for the month of March, and it was very popular, and so they offered me a job permanently as Martha Washington, as the young Martha Washington. So it worked out very well.
So both of you have known each other for quite some time. How did you get started, Mary?
Well, I was working with the characters at Colonial Williamsburg, and I loved working on creating the characters and doing the research, helping them to create their characters, to find out about these people of the past. Well, when I first started studying about Martha Washington, and I had known Susan when she was a young teenage girl who came to work with us. That was a great opportunity as a young person there. I thought she'd be the perfect one to play young Martha Washington. I used to introduce her program, and I'd say, of all the people I've ever studied, Martha Washington is my favorite. Little did I know that later on, when it was needed that Mrs. Washington get, shall we say, a little older, I'd qualify to do that. And lo and behold, I loved portraying her so much, I came to Mount Vernon to be here all the time, just as she did so long ago.
What did you like most about Martha Washington now that you have done so much research?
Oh, I really like her philosophy, and you see it especially when she's older in the presidency. It's kind of this: if you do it my way or the highway. She was very strong-willed, but she knew when she had to step up to duty, and she did that without complaining. Mm-hmm. And I think her idea of wanting to be happy and letting that affect your outlook on life was very important, and certainly got her through many difficult times in her life. So that's one of my favorite aspects about her.
It sounds like she's very courageous, and she took charge of her surroundings. Would you say that, Mary?
Yes, she did. And she had a very sad life, children. When you think about it, she lost all 4 of her children that were born to her, and all of her brothers and sisters. She had to be away from the home she loved almost half the time that they had it here at Mount Vernon, and it'd be very hard to do. But she loved her family, and she loved the general. I think her devotion to him is something I think is very special indeed. Everyone noticed it.
We have time for one question from our audience. Who has the next question? Oh, look at all these questions. How about this young man right down front? What is your name and what's your question?
Hi, I'm Lewis, and I was wondering, what was your opinion on slavery?
Well, Lewis, that's a very complicated question, but one that we always like to talk about and answer here at Mount Vernon. I myself, of course, have been brought up in our century to have a very different view than Mrs. Washington. But when I talk about what she felt about slavery, I have to remember to present what she felt from her time to help the visitors of today to understand what it was like in those days to have been born to nothing else but that. And it's a good opportunity for everyone to begin to talk about such subjects. So I'm glad you brought it up. I hope we'll have more times to talk about it.
All right. Any other questions? We have time for one quick one. How about the young man in the back with the red shirt on?
Hi, my name is Raymond, and I wanted to get your opinion on the war.
All right.
The war for independency that won our independency?
That would be for you.
Well, we weren't always thinking about being independent, and it was a great, important thing that was done. What everyone should know that, of course, we didn't when I was your age. I never expected to be anything but a loyal subject of His Majesty. So little by little, we came to know that as free English people, we ought to have more rights than we had. And it gradually came to us this was the only way. But no one takes war lightly. It's a very serious thing to step into.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Now, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to all of the students here in the audience and around the country who asked such interesting questions. And thank you to our Martha Washingtons, Susan Zeckel and Mary Wiseman. And finally, thank you to Mount Vernon for hosting this event. A DVD of this program is available to schools free of charge. For more information, please go to our website at www.fcps.edu/Fairfax Network. Quantities are limited. I'm Kate Sullivan. Thanks for joining us for The Real Martha Washington.